I absolutely love The Hunger Games, and if anyone has anything bad to say about it, you're wrong. I think I mentioned in my review for the Divergent series that The Hunger Games was not my first YA dystopian franchise. It was actually Divergent, of all things, so you can only imagine my absolute delight when I finally got to The Hunger Games. It took me a while to get to it, because The Hunger Games has this interesting reputation of being YA, and YA is usually seen as lesser for the girls and whatever other nonsense stuff you can come up with, and I have no idea how this somehow resulted in me getting to see Divergent but not The Hunger Games. Genuinely don't ask. And I honestly hate that, because it was also why I got into it way too late into the game. Like, my first Hunger Games movie was The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 1, because I just saw it in cinemas while having nothing else to see, and it still in many ways remains my favorite movie in the franchise. So I missed a lot of the hype surrounding the movies as it came in pretty late in the game, and I hate that too. The release of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes kind of healed that inner teen in me, and I got to participate in reading it ASAP and going to the premiere of the movie. Why do I bring this up? I think this sort of outlook towards the Hunger Games is just wrong. I kind of always side-eye people when they just lump them into the YA dystopian genre along with all the slop. Sure, it is YA and it doesn't do much to beat the allegations, but I think it is way more than that. Hunger Games just has so many elements that elevates it beyond YA. Anyway, you get the gist. The Hunger Games, both the movies and the books, they're not perfect by any means. They're not examples of the most perfect literature, and that is what I think is so interesting about it. So if I was to summarize how I feel about the Hunger Games, I can say that I love what it stands for in the concepts, but I don't always agree with how the series goes about it. We are going to go through all the movies and just have an honest look at what they do, sometimes in the context of the books too, because contrary to nobody's belief, I too can be literate sometimes. Let's go.
I think it's our tradition.
The first movie is kinda whack. Let me explain before you throw your chairs at me. So the movie plot is this. Set in some undisclosed time in the future in the territory of North America, it shows the fictional country of Panem, which is divided into districts. 12 of the districts have to go through the reaping and send a boy and a girl each year into something called the Hunger Games, where children die to death and one of them emerges as the victor. Our protagonist, Katniss Everdeen of District 12, sees her younger sister getting raped and volunteers.
I volunteer as tribute!
Iconic, amazing storytelling. Katniss is our young adult teen girl protagonist, and we see her go into the 74th annual Hunger Games. So the plot of the movie is great. I love it. Basically, everyone loves it, and it has been analyzed to death at this point. I won't bring anything new to the table for this one, so let's talk about something more unique. It's not really unique, but it's a sticking point to me, and I have to complain about it. I would be the first to admit that the Hunger Games first movie is not included on my rewatches, and that is because I kind of find it hard to sit through. It is also why I kind of hesitate recommending the movie series to people, because it's a bit hard to convince people to get down this path when the first movie is really, it's not the best. All the respect for it since it started it all, but I just don't vibe with the movie in many ways. That is excluding the book. I love the book. For instance, I really deeply dislike some of the directing choices. The constant camera shaking and random ass cuts have already been dragged through hell, and you cannot really understate how not good that decision is. It is a struggle to watch the movie when things are constantly moving. The intention is clear. It is to show the anxiety, the unease in the districts and the games. Valid. I don't think you need to have much brain to connect those dots, but it does lose a lot of its punch once you see it used for Katniss just walking into the forest from her home. Like, I don't think she feels the same amount of anxiety here as in the games. There are also just some stupid things in there, like Pila's makeup in the games, and the weird hallucination of Caesar. And just weird-ass camera choices, honestly. I cannot overstate just how much I see what the movie is trying to do and I agree with it, but the movie goes overboard with it and has no chill. And I get it. It's a movie about kids killing each other in the arena. They want you to feel like you're Katniss, but the movie also has to be at least palatable. And in instances like these, I think it is better to meet people halfway rather than try and make them sit through some ultra-accurate perspective choice. I would rather have a movie with such an important message be more accessible rather than take some deeply artistic route that can easily alienate people, you know? It feels like an indie movie in a very shit way, but there are also many things that I love that make it stand out above other movies. The thing I realized only this movie does is they really treat the audience as completely new to this world. It sounds dumb when I put it like that, so let me elaborate. The movie goes through every step of the game meticulously. The games begin only maybe an hour into this 2-hour movie, and we get to see all of the steps to get there. And then the games portion of the movie was actually treated more like an actual TV show. I in particular liked how they took their time to show Katniss's family and Gale sitting and watching.
25, 24, 23.
Like, it happened super briefly, but it did jolt you awake to the reality of the games. It reminds you that these tributes have an entire family and friends out there that also have to watch you get unceremoniously killed on live television in front of the entire Panem, and that is just such a grim thought to have. And then there would also be these little bits with Caesar and his sidekick commenting on stuff, and then we would get some game maker action. Honestly, I really liked this approach. It made you feel like you were kinda part of the Capitol watching. It felt more global in a way, since we got to see all the perspectives at least for some time. We also get to see President Snow, but his perspective is a bit whack since he's just hanging out in the Rose Garden all the time and yaps about hope, and that's about it. Still a very nice bonus to have. But expanding these perspectives did come at a cost. While we got to see Gale sulking around seeing Katniss be lovey-dovey with Peeta, and we got to see Snow talking and the Capitol reacting to the games, we lost some valuable time with Katniss and Peeta. The one aspect that always came off as weird, especially in the context of subsequent movies, is that your supposed connection comes off as undercooked. It's supposed to be like this at first, obviously, but I never thought that the connection between Katniss and Peeta was more than just an act. Clearly Peeta has something for Katniss, but I never believed that she felt anything reciprocal towards him in a romantic sense in the first movie. Granted, I didn't think she felt much of that for Gale either. The movie wants to give the love triangle thing, but I never even for a second bought it. In the first movie especially, it feels like just 3 dots, maybe a line and a dot at best. Certainly not a triangle. Also, Peeta in the movie is far from the platonic ideal of Peeta in the book. And while there are some iffy aspects of the movie, it is still at least an 8 out of 10 for me for just how much it manages to do for the Hunger Games franchise as a whole. The movie had like half the budget of the subsequent movies. It was 2012, and YA wasn't the powerhouse cinematic genre we would know it to become for a brief stint, and I think it came out the best it could under those circumstances. It also got us where we are now, and honestly, respect. And then it got followed by... The Hunger Games Catching Fire is an amazing sequel, as well as an amazing prelude to what comes next. So what happened was that they switched the directors for this one. First one was done by Gary Ross, and all of the other movies from then forward are done by Francis Lawrence. They pulled a reverse Divergent move, or rather Divergent pulled a reverse Hunger Games, but you get it. If you asked a Hunger Games fan which was their favorite movie, you will most likely get Catching Fire as the answer, both because it's great adaptation of the book, and also because it's a cool frigging movie. Also, it had like double the budget of the first, so you know, it is a proper blockbuster now. So firstly, the cinematography, thank the fucking heavens, was fixed. I was pleasantly surprised and absolutely delighted to see that the scenes finally had proper continuity, cameras weren't carried by people who had butterfingers, and the changing shots actually flowed between each other. The art direction also pulled the Divergent series Insurgent but in reverse and was massively upgraded and improved, and this is why I always rewatch the series from this movie onwards. Well, one of the reasons. We will get into another one later. And then the plot itself is genuinely amazing progression in the saga, because the movie, on God, feels like a ticking fucking time bomb, wink wink, and it is so delicious to watch. The first movie had 74th Hunger Games, and Katniss and Peeta won the games by doing a huge fuck you towards the Capitol.
Stop! Stop! Ladies and gentlemen, I present the winners of the 74th Annual Hunger Games.
The second movie sees them go on a victory tour to do the propaganda work for the Capitol. Well, the problem is that their little fuck you to the Capitol made everyone else in the districts feel empowered to also engage in acts of rebellion. And their victory tour and life post-victory goes on in the movie for quite a while actually. Like, it takes 45 minutes of the movie for us to even get to the revelation that the Capitol made up a way to get Katniss to die by dragging her back into the arena. Because it's a quarter quell this time, and it happens every 25 years, and it's the 75th Hunger Games, and the games have special rules during those. So the victors are being reaped and have to get back into the arena. Cool idea, amazing progression from the first. The movie really conveys the seriousness of the situation so well. The movie has aura. The movie has vibes. I really like that they show the other tributes. They give us way more info on them. Oh, and the interviews with the tributes and how everyone in different ways was trying to weasel their way out of it. It was absolutely delicious to see. I think even without knowing the end of the movie, movie and watching it for the first time, you can tell that things are crumbling pretty badly. Even when you hear that they are getting sent back into the games, you think that you might have misheard it with just how ridiculous and unfair it sounds. It really does feel like there is no coming back after this point, which only adds aura. The one thing I will give this franchise shit for is unintentional inconsistency. The second movie tries to be as close as possible as an adaptation, which is not a bad thing and I respect it. But in some ways this movie retcons things in the first movie, which is also why I don't like touching the first movie and it feels so disconnected to me. For instance, Peeta feels like a different character, for the better of course, but in the first movie, he had his little interview thing with Caesar, and he had a bit of bravado.
Okay, well the showers here are weird.
Showers?
Yes.
We have different showers.
I have a question for you, Caesar. Do I smell like roses to you?
But I didn't really buy that. They might have lifted that one from the book without having the additional character work to support it, but Peeta did not feel like he warranted that confidence. In this movie, he has more wit and charm, which is actually nice. His relationship with Katniss also felt a bit more believable from this point forwards. Sure, the first movie didn't leave the most powerful foundation for their ship, but fuck it, I am ignoring that and headcanoning shit. Another thing that we lost in the faithfulness was more varied perspective of the games. Caesar is suddenly all alone yapping in the studio, his buddy is not even there anymore, and suddenly we are this extra close and tight holding on to what Katniss sees and hears. I get that, I respect it, I understand it, but I cannot lie when I say that I kind of missed seeing outside of the arena while the games are happening. I think it would have slapped extra hard just to see the general confusion of everyone when the force field broke, or when strange things were happening during the games, or when District 12 got bombed and the lead up to that. It's not really a mark against the movie that it wasn't there, but I would die to see something like that just to really hammer in home the magnitude of the event and that Panem is over. But the movie is 2 hours long and it's already pretty beefy and has no time to spare, and I understand that, and I get that. All in all, I think it's very safe to say that we reached the peak of the Hunger Games. To me, it's a comfortable 10 out of 10. And then we reach the very, very interesting point of the games are over. Now what? So let's put our thinking hats on and sit down to think about why we flocked to the Hunger Games in the first place. The main attraction was the Hunger Games. I mean, the first two movies and books are popular because of the games. The Hunger Games as a concept works really well for both YA books and YA blockbuster movies. It gives you a spectacle. It gives you something to look forward to. It gives you a clear resolution. But it wasn't only that, was it? I think it is interesting to realize that out of 4 games that we have seen in the books, none of them were in any way the conventional games. For instance, the 10th Hunger Games weren't even focused on the victor, but rather on President Snow. Spoilers. The 50th was a quarter quell and also had a whole rebel plot in there. The 75th was a quarter quell and also turned out to have a rebel plot in there that kickstarted the rebellion. Even the games that started it all, the 74th, were not the regular games. It also kickstarted rebellion and was unusual because of the whole lovers act Peeta and Katniss pulled, and both of them managing to win. Truth be told, we have never seen regular Hunger Games, so it is all more baffling to me that people are actively campaigning to see more of the games. I don't think that they would be as interesting as people think they would be. Even from a practical point of view, it would be wildly difficult to come up with something to keep them as interesting. An interesting idea for an arena certainly wouldn't carry a book or a movie. The Hunger Games, obviously, weren't about the games. They were always about what they meant, which is how it should be. We have seen far too many properties just succumb to their gimmick and churn out meaningless slop, which is where we arrive at the fact that we only hear about the Hunger Games when the Hunger Games actually have something to say. It is no secret that the author of the book, Suzanne Collins, is not exactly in this for the money, but she just puts out books for the love of the game. Pun not entirely intended, but I respect the hell out of the author for the way she approaches this universe, because you will never see a book on the games just because she loves writing kids dying. Nuh-uh. If she has to show it, she has a very deep reason to do it. I am drooling about all this because we have so far talked about 2 of the 5 existing movies. And the funny thing about the rest of the movies is that they all have exactly 6.6 stars on IMDb. It's the same as the first Divergent movie, which makes me a bit peeved to say the least. And it is also a notable difference from the first 2 installments. And I think that the first 2 movies are the closest we got to actual games content, which does say something about this trend, doesn't it? So it makes you wonder, is it the lack of proper games that make people tap out of the franchise? Or is it because the movies suddenly become crap? So strap in, people, because we have just covered only the tip of the iceberg. So let's talk about the gameless elephant in the room, The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 1 and Part 2. Listen, I get why Mockingjay movies often trend towards the bottom of the popular vote. First of all, they were based on an already kind of a weak book. The third book, aka Mockingjay, was already known to be not the strongest soldier in the bunch. But in my opinion, it was also these movies and this book that truly separated The Hunger Games from the rest of the YA dystopian genre. Imagine this, you have a book that you want to adapt, and you have a shit ton of material from it, but you also want to show the events properly. So the movie only really has two options. Try to do it justice in one movie, or try to do it justice in two. I think the best option ultimately would have been an in-between maybe, a longer than usual feature film, like maybe 3 hours to depict the grand finale of the franchise. That wasn't necessarily an option back in 2013 or whenever the decision was made, as it would have been and still is a lot to expect the general audiences to sit down for 3 hours and watch a Hunger Games movie. I would have, but many probably wouldn't. So instead, we have two movies that also came out at a time where splitting up final books into movies was becoming a bit of a gimmick, and that idea was thought to have worked only once, which was Harry Potter. It is not a popular decision, but because I am a content creator on YouTube with a European accent, sveiki gyvi lietuviai jeigu žiūrit, I am contractually obligated to be the contrarian, because I, personally, really like the fact that they did this. Call me crazy, but I enjoy the fact that we have 4 hours to see the final stages of Panama's an authoritarian regime. And Mockingjay Part 1, I would argue, is exactly what separates and elevates the Hunger Games from any other YA schlock. And I kinda want to emphasize some cognitive dissonance that happened surrounding this movie in particular. I thought that the Hunger Games as a franchise was so liked because it was way more realistic and grounded than other franchises. So I think it is a bit contradictory to view these movies as lesser, because make no mistake, because make no beefsteak. Because these movies were brought to you of the same mentality of the franchise trying to be realistic. I think it is interesting to see how people's opinions can be towards these movies, because at times it does feel like people sometimes don't really want good realistic writing despite saying otherwise. They want a gripping, fast-paced narrative, which is not exactly a sin to want, but we come to these interesting crossroads where Hunger Games are praised for being realistic and having something to say, but the last book, which arguably has the most to show you, is not as well liked. The book itself, it does have its own issues. But it's important to say that it's not because people who don't enjoy it as much are dumb. Let's get that straight. It's not that people miss the point, they are not dumb, they just don't enjoy that type of narrative depth in this particular subject matter. But Mockingjay simply has to be this way. So both the book and the movies just inherently are at a disadvantage because of this. I think it is okay to admit that war planning is not as exciting as kids getting murdered in a fancy arena, but the more interesting debate is whether the expanded runtime actually helps the case or not. I think that it is a huge case of you win some, but you fucking lose some. And when you lose some, you really fucking lose some, if you know what I'm freaking saying. So the first movie adapts the first 12 chapters of the Mockingjay book, and its biggest sin is that it commits to depicting rebellion and warfare in a real and grueling fashion. One of the bigger critiques against this movie is that it loses momentum after the bombastic installment that was catching fire, and that critique is, I think, completely valid. Part 1 brings the overarching plot basically to a stop for a second there, since Katniss is rescued from the arena and needs time to recover. Up until that point, the rebellion was very much involving Katniss, since she was the turning point, the symbol. And in Catching Fire, we were focused on Katniss because she was, well, the main character who was thrust into this position. But I think to understand Mockingjay, we also must understand Katniss as a character. I think the reason why Mockingjay resonates with me in particular is because of just how much it stays true to Katniss as a character. From the very beginning, we were following a main character who was actually not the center of all action. The first two movies allowed her to be because she was raped for the games. Once we get to the Mockingjay movies, the focus understandably moves towards the rebellion, and Katniss is not even the main force behind it. Just like in the game, she is not proactive participant in any of it, but she does participate in rebellion because she knows it is the right thing to do and just wants to protect people closest to her. And that, understandably, doesn't make for the most exciting cinema. But I would argue that neither does warfare in general. It was a ballsy move to make a movie about Naughty Lot in particular, but what we do see is all the more valuable. The movie shows the rebels stumble and fumble in trying to create a propaganda strategy for the rebellion. First, they try to go all flashy under the guidance of Plutarch Heavensby, which makes sense since he is from the capital and that is how they do it over there. That is until Haymitch suggests to be more genuine and unscripted and to actually show the destruction made by the capital. And you know, Katniss goes out there and does the thing that people ask her to do. We get introduced to a handful of characters who are the filming crew, and we see them direct her, and it is as mundane and boring as it can get. I will admit that. And the whole first movie is exactly like this. We see the rebellion take steps to try and combat the capital through indirect means and to stoke the country. It certainly doesn't add excitement that this movie focuses on the rebellion building momentum without actually fighting, but while we can argue that the movie doesn't show X, Y, and Z, I think I just appreciate where the movie does put its attention to. The rebellion moves in incremental steps, but every move is followed by a reaction of some sort from the opposing side. We constantly move in this escalating spiral between the rebels making a move and the capital making a counter move. And the movie's highest heights and lowest lows come from the fact that we are stuck with Katniss. It works extremely well when it comes to Peeta. All we see of Peeta throughout the movies is him on a TV screen being consumed by Capital's propaganda machine. There was even a scene they deleted between Peeta and President Snow in Snow's mansion.
You know the difference between reality and destructive adolescent fantasies. You were always the thoughtful one, less impulsive than Katniss. The sooner these uprisings are put to rest, the sooner you'll see your home again.
So you're asking me to be what, sir? Your voice of reason?
You've understood everything but one small detail. I'm not asking.
And while the scene was cool, I was very happy they deleted it. I think the movie is very emotionally manipulative, affectionately, because for 2 movies we got to know Peeta pretty personally through the eyes of Katniss, and we also came to care for him because Katniss does, and to have him just pulled away from us like that, and then used by the Capitol hits pretty damn hard. Like, it genuinely hurts to see a character who was on our side be exploited like that, and I think that emotion translates beautifully into the movie. His absence is felt through Katniss constantly thinking about him. I don't believe Katniss ever really expressed her love and yearning towards Peeta in an explicit way, but make no mistake, the movie very much indicates that the feelings are there and that they are deep. There is a scene where Katniss is asleep and wakes up distressed after a nightmare. Peeta runs into her room and she asks him to stay.
I'm sorry. It's just a nightmare.
It's okay. I get them too.
Peeta, will you stay with me?
Yeah.
And he gets into her bed as she rests her head on his chest, only to find out it was all a dream, or rather a nightmare honestly. Because Peeta is not with her, he's being tortured by the Capitol. It is these moments that really make the movie emotional, but they also never betray the character of Katniss by making her be sappy and mopey over Peeta. And I think that the movie also shines in places where it needed to invent things that were not in the book. For instance, the movie adapts only the first 12 chapters. It doesn't really fit into the conventional 3-act structure as is. Peeta's rescue from the Capitol, which basically serves as the 3rd act battle, is only roughly the midway point of the book, and a lot of what is shown in the movie either happens off-screen or doesn't happen at all. I think that the movie makes an extremely good move of expanding this event and making it the 3rd act, because it also pays off Peeta's arc as a propaganda tool in a very cruel but a very fitting way. They make Katniss and Snow have a confrontation as the rescue team is in the Capitol trying to rescue the victors, and the whole confrontation is brilliant writing. It shows extremely well just how conniving Snow is, and it's one of the coldest moments in history of the Hunger Games, when the rebels think they are in control, but Snow manages to pull the rug from under them once again.
Don't you think I know your friends are in the tribute center? Cut them off.
Just in general, the entire sequence is a substantial improvement over what happens in the book. In the book, Peeta is not sitting in the studio with just Caesar, but with President Snow as well. He warns District 13 over the coming attack and gets visibly beaten on screen, and there is blood. But right before that, there's also President Snow, who just comes off as way less menacing. Snow plows forward, saying that clearly the rebels are now attempting to disrupt the dissemination of information they find incriminating, but both truth and justice will reign. The full broadcast will resume when security has been reinstated. Mockingjay, Chapter 9. So I just deeply prefer the movie's interpretation of these events over the books, but being so intimate with Katniss also brings certain disadvantages. Another series of heights that the movie experiences are all the small snippets of rebel activity that we get to see throughout Panem. The book had this to an extreme where a ton of things happen off screen, and that is, I think, the main criticisms towards the book as well. And for the record, the movies try to rectify this, but maybe not always to its fullest potential. An extremely memorable scene is the bombing of the dam that is accompanied by the hanging tree. It is extremely effective, and also adds some very needed show of effects that propaganda is having over the country. A more interesting tidbit comes right after, where we see the direct effects of it on the Capitol.
Moves and counter moves.
It is only a shame that these small scenes of snow and the capital are just that, they are small scenes. I always thought that what was sorely lacking in this rebellion narrative is the perspective from the other side. We get some glimpses from Snow, but there is so much ground to explore in regards to how this rebellion campaign affects the lives of those in the capital. I would imagine it would be a very rough blow to the average citizen of an authoritarian regime to have their supreme leader seen as stumbling when suddenly electricity goes out and suddenly their channels are flooded with propaganda of what President Snow did. Would that pierce their bubble? Would that make them snap out of their brainwashing? How would they react? We get glimpses of what exactly the capital thinks of the districts in Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. It would have been way more valuable to also see what their opinions were of them during Katniss's times. If I was to levy one critique against the Hunger Games as a narrative, it would be the generalized nature in which it approaches the whole rebellion storyline. It ignores a lot of dimensions such as economic conditions, logistics, quality of life, and all that mundane stuff. It chooses to focus on the sentimental side of the rebellion and the basics of propaganda. It is not a critique that is supposed to tear Hunger Games apart due to its weight. Hunger Games is YA in its parameters through and through. It cannot be blamed for trying to present this information in a way that is digestible. It sure does the job leagues better than certain other works of fiction, but it does become slightly ridiculous that both Plutarch and Snow are walking around mumbling about the lofty and grand concepts of hope and stoking the fire, which can border on caricature in the lack of nuance it has. It is a missed opportunity for Mockingjay Part 1 to flesh this aspect out with the additional screen time that it has, because I would imagine that the mutinies in the districts do become difficult to contain after a certain while, which leads to shortages of various goods and necessities, which leads to discomfort for the ruling class, which could lead to people in Snow's close circles questioning him. There is a reason why, for instance, luxury brands cannot sell their goods to certain people from certain countries nowadays. It does inevitably end up narrowing the conflict between Katniss's circle of people and Snow. Maybe let's put a pin in that, shall we? Maybe for the series' detriment, but I think such developments would make Snow more fallible and less OP. But again, not exactly a huge issue it is not there, since it's not in the book either as far as I recall. I still absolutely love the things that the movie does focus on. And then we finally get to the finale, Mockingjay Part 2. In some ways I like it more than Part 1, and in some ways I kinda like it less due to some adaptational choices. For starters, the rebels finally move into a more active phase of the rebellion. The rebels begin their offensive by taking over the Nut, which is a stronghold in District 2. They managed to do that successfully and they gain control of the capital's arsenal. Which is sick, finally some action, right? I really like how the movie plays with the idea of the capital becoming an arena for the unofficial 76th Hunger Games, because Snow, while most likely recognizing he is now officially fucked, decides to turn the march of the rebels to the capital into yet another thrilling killing game for himself, because he's a petty, unrelenting bitch.
Lure them into the city, and then our game makers will make them pay for every inch with blood.
The game makers turn the streets of the capital into a series of booby traps and plant these killing machines called pods basically every 5 steps. And Katniss finally gets to be more proactive in the effort. She sneaks away from District 13 into District 2 and gets to join the so-called Star Squad. They are this hand-picked group of combat experts who are behind the front lines by a week or so, and they are tasked with capturing footage for the propaganda. And so the squad somehow has a whole map of the so-called pods that they call the Hollow. It does not explain how they acquired it. We can only assume the capital security began slacking, and so we also see Katniss be coached out there to pose for the propos and whatnot. And I gotta be honest, the concept of pods always kinda tripped me up because it just poses too many questions for my overthinking ass. I assume they weren't baked into the architecture of the capital, so the game makers had to set them up sometime during the rebellion, but they also became a thing in the city streets after the civilian population was evacuated. But then, in the limited amount of time that they had, they managed to somehow integrate every one of them into the surroundings seamlessly. I get they have advanced tech, but that seems a bit like fantasy writing. Furthermore, we see that people were evacuated from their homes in the capital, and apparently not much else came from it. We have already discussed how the series sort of glosses over what happens during the rebellion to the average capital citizen, and it's not really that big of a critique. It does take a lot of suspension of disbelief though, that there were absolutely no repercussions within the capital itself in the massive move. Like, I bet people would be hella inconvenienced and mad over having to leave their luxurious apartments to whatever the fuck. Not a bad thing it's not included, but it does feel a bit weird. We also get to see Peeta struggle throughout the movie since President Snow turned him into a living weapon against Katniss, and tell you what, I really like that they included that, and to what extent they did that. There is an immense amount of tragedy in Katniss reuniting with him after a whole movie being apart and him returning to her hijacked. That part, was fucking epic. Honestly, every part of the second Mockingjay movie is pretty great conceptually. Gale, the walking self-centered moron that he is. Even he has characterization that while makes him an unlikable idiot,
even if those civilians are just mopping floors, they're helping the enemy. And if they have to die, I can live with that.
it makes sense why he is the way he is. And then we come to the character of Alma Coin. I like her conceptually and completely agree with her inclusion and importance. I don't particularly like how we got to her at the end. So she is the leader of District 13 and the Rebellion. And in the first Mockingjay movie, she doesn't really have much of a character besides always being poised and strategic. There are moments where she seems genuinely concerned for Katniss. When Gale and others are away attempting to rescue Peeta and the communication from them is lost, she shows up and shows genuine care for Katniss.
There's no news. I'm sorry. It's the worst torture in the world. Waiting when you know there's nothing you can do. Especially for people like us. Whatever strength, courage keeps us going, you find it times like these. You have it, soldier. It's what's kept you alive all this time.
There are plenty of other instances where she seems rather cold, but she still shows care. At no moment does she seem compromised or operating with ulterior motive. She even goes through some lengths to lift up Katniss, agreeing to her concessions when asked. There's only one moment where she says that she would have preferred to have rescued Peeta.
Maybe you should have rescued the boy instead.
No, listen to me. No one else can do this but her.
This is not the girl you described.
But that is nondescript as far as characterization goes. If anything, it just kind of indicates that she doesn't know shit about propaganda and Plutarch is there butting heads with her and getting things on the right track. I don't think there is a single suggestion from Plutarch that she decided not to take. So imagine my surprise when Katniss wonders why Peeta was sent to the front lines and Boggs tells her that Coin sees her as a threat.
It was Peeta that she wanted rescued from the arena. She never liked you. She doesn't like anybody or anything she can't control.
So she would put my life in danger?
She denied. One way or another, this war is going to come to an end. They promised a free election. Maybe she's starting to see you as a threat.
And that would not even cross your mind up until that point, because the evidence for that was non-existent. And this is where the movie engages more in telling instead of showing. And I don't particularly like that. You may point to the fact that Katniss even had to request pardons for the former victors in the first place. Alma mentions that there would be a tribunal and Peeta would be held accountable for what he said.
They're doing and saying whatever they can to survive. Individuals don't make demands in 13. There will be a tribunal on a fair judgment.
We as an audience obviously know that is morally incorrect, but the movie doesn't necessarily point to this being some weird moral decision for Coin. I mean, yeah, sure, of course, having a tribunal for a victim and then somehow making the victim justify themselves, not the best look, but it doesn't exactly indicate that she is some authoritarian figure. But I think it is important to look at how exactly the movie presents this decision. The fact is that there is no indication in the movie that a tribunal would result in him getting unjustly punished. Again, it is not a great look that they think like this in the first place, but I need to explain this right now for later, trust me. The one thing that did make me raise my eyebrow in the movie, and the closest we got to a hint of Alma being a bit sketchy, was the way she phrased the announcement in front of everyone.
If Katniss Everdeen fails to fulfill her duties, the deal will be off.
But at the time, I just interpreted it as her just not having faith in Katniss in general, since Katniss was always portrayed to be Plutarch's project, not Coin's. Coin was slightly more friendly with Katniss after she proved herself in that way.
Plutarch's faith in you wasn't misplaced. Thank you.
So you can see how that wouldn't exactly register. You could interpret her demeanor as fake and manipulative. If you went this route, you can see Coin getting close to Katniss during the rescue as calculated and conniving. Coin does seem a bit controlled in the way she behaves, but who is to say that she is just not behaving the way she was raised? I wouldn't imagine anyone being bubbly and fun and charismatic, having grown up in what is essentially an underground nuclear bunker in a constant war prep mode. There are just so many adaptational choices that give way to explanations that are way more reasonable rather than just jumping to the conclusion that she's evil, which makes me agree with her for the majority of the time until the bombing, and I don't want to agree with an evil authoritarian, and now I must admit to you that I fibbed a little just earlier when talking about the first Mockingjay movie. While I praise the Mockingjay narrative being split in two, it also delivers a very unfortunate downside. While we are talking about the way Alma Coin is presented in the movies, we have to talk about how she is presented in the book, because both the movie and the books do land on the same conclusion due to the adaptational demands. The movie, however, doesn't choose to include important book elements that supported the shared conclusion. It is important to note that book Katniss is beefing with Coin pretty early on. She doesn't trust her right off the bat. Granted, Katniss isn't a very trusting kind of a person, but Coin is way more overtly antagonizing towards Katniss and the people she cares about. This is mostly conveyed through Katniss's internal monologue, which I don't blame the movie for not exactly translating. What I do blame the movie for not translating is what happens in chapters 3 and 4 of Mockingjay. Chapter 3 of Mockingjay sees her make demands for the pardons of the taken victors, but the sequence actually first begins with a demand for her family to be able to keep the cat. But I have some conditions. I smooth out the list and begin. My family gets to keep our cat. My tiniest request sets off an argument. The Capitol rebels see this as a non-issue. Of course I can keep my pet, while those from 13 spell out what extreme difficulties this presents. Finally, it's worked out that we'll be moved to the top level, which has the luxury of an 8-inch window above ground. Buttercup may come and go to do his business. He will be expected to feed himself. If he misses curfew, he will be locked out. If he causes any security problems, he'll be shot immediately. This immediately sets the mood for the scene. District 13 comes off as extremely rigid if a cat is something that sets off an entire argument. In the movie adaptation, this is actually right at the very end and is played off with levity.
Do you have any other conditions?
My sister gets to keep her cat.
Prim does raise concerns earlier in the movie whether they would be allowed to keep the cat.
They have strict rules. I don't know what they'll do if they find him here.
But we are later shown the cat to exist in District 13 with not much issue. The book scene continues further with a demand that wasn't included in the movie scene, but was allowed to be done in the movie.
I got good news. Coin agreed to let us hunt above ground.
That was the demand that she would go hunting on the surface. Katniss then continues. I skim my list. Gale, I'll need him with me to do this. With you how? Off camera? By your side at all times? Do you want him presented as your new lover? Coin asks. She hasn't said this in any particular malice. Quite the contrary. Her words are very matter of fact, but my mouth still drops open in shock. What? I think we should continue the current romance. A quick defection from Peeta could cause an audience to lose sympathy for her, says Plutarch, especially since they think she's pregnant with his child. Agreed. So on screen, Gale can simply be portrayed as a fellow rebel. Is that alright? Says Coin. I just stare at her. She repeats herself impatiently. For Gale, will that be sufficient? I'm rattled by the turn in the conversation. The implications that I could so readily dispose of Peeta, that I'm in love with Gale, that the whole thing has been an act. My cheeks begin to burn. The very notion that I am devoting any thought to who I want presented as my lover, given our current circumstances, is demeaning. I let my anger propel me into my greatest demand. When the war is over, if we won, Peeta will be pardoned. Dead silence. I feel Gale's body tense. I guess I should have told him before, but I wasn't sure how he'd respond, not when it involved Peeta. No form of punishment will be inflicted, I continue. A new thought occurs to me. The same goes for the other captured tributes, Joanna and Enobaria. Frankly, I don't care about Enobaria, the vicious tribute from District 2. In fact, I dislike her, but it seems wrong to leave her out. No, says Coin flatly. Katniss fails to mention Annie. Keep that in mind. Okay, let's continue. Yes, I shoot back. It's not their fault you abandoned them in the arena. Who knows what the Capitol's doing to them? They'll be tried with other war criminals and treated as the tribunal sees fit, she says. They'll be granted immunity. I feel myself rising from my chair with voice full and resonant. You will personally pledge this in front of the entire population of District 13 and the remainder of 12. Soon. Today. It will be recorded for future generations. You will hold yourself and your government responsible for their safety, or you'll find yourself another Mockingjay. I really channeled J-Law in there. Oof. And I think that the difference between how Coin is portrayed in this scene and how Katniss is portrayed in this scene versus how they are portrayed in the movie is kind of night and day. First of all, Katniss is way more collected and poised in the movie, and so is Coin. In the book, she's clearly very much keeping her fingers on the pulse of the entire narrative propaganda side of warfare, and she also goes as far as to call the other tributes war criminals and says that they will be treated as the tribunal sees fit, which is not at all how she phrases herself in the movie.
There will be a tribunal on a fair judgment. Thank you.
It should be noted that Katniss's insistence on it being public, which is sustained in the movie adaptation.
The victors will be granted immunity, and you will announce that in front of the entire population of 13.
Most likely comes from Katniss's already existing distrust of Coin. She likely sees this as a way for her to keep her word. Eventually, both the book and movie Coin agree to these conditions, but movie Coin expresses herself in a way more agreeable demeanor, while the book Coin seemingly taunts her at the end. Alright, Coin says finally, but you'd better perform. I'll perform when you've made the announcement, I say. Then we transition between chapters 3 and 4. At the very end of chapter 3, Katniss discovers that her prep team for the games, the same people that worked with Cinna, were detained. I dart around the distracted guard, push open the door marked 3908, and find them, half naked, bruised, and shackled to the wall. My prep team. This particular tidbit didn't even make it into the movies. Hilarious, because Flavius and Octavia were in the second movie, so it's not like they were culled from the adaptation completely. They were not in the third movie because, if you are to believe the Hunger Games wiki, there are reports indicating that they indeed filmed scenes, but these were cut as filmmakers wanted to focus on what was central to the plot. I would personally think that portraying another evil dictator that was spearheading the rebellion should have been central to the plot, but apparently not. Now, because the movies are absolute shit at conveying this, District 13 in the books is shown to be extremely strict in the way they operate.
Now I'm condemned to this life of jumpsuits. Can you believe this place? I miss coffee. I never knew any place could be so strict.
Throughout the novel, it's very explicitly noted that everyone has temporary tattoo schedules on their hands and they adhere to them very strictly, and everyone receives food that is very strictly rationed. The whole place is very big on order and rules. The movies don't show any of this for whatever reason, but it is a very important context to also understand what happens next. So we get into chapter 4, and it is explained to us that Katniss's prep team was detained because they committed the crime of stealing bread, which is a big no-no in the district. Now I want you to think about how severe this reaction is. I don't believe we get precedent on how other citizens would be treated, but Katniss, as she so usually does, makes an interesting point. Plutarch and Fulvia take the bench across from us but don't offer any comments on the state of my prep team. If they had no knowledge of the mistreatment, then what do they make of this move on President Coin's part? I decide to help them out. I guess we've all been put on notice, I say. What? No, what do you mean? Asks Fulvia. Punishing my prep team's a warning, I tell her. Not just me, but you too. About who's really in control and what happens if she's not obeyed. If you had any delusions about having power, I'd let them go now. Apparently a capital pedigree is no protection here. Maybe it's even a liability. Perhaps we're a little more necessary to the war effort than you give us credit for, says Plutarch, unconcerned. Of course you are. The tributes were necessary to the games too, until they weren't, I say. And then we were very disposable. Right, Plutarch? That ends the conversation. Later on in the chapter, Katniss makes efforts to defend her prep team against Gale, who is only interested in inserting himself as deep into Coin's anal cavity as humanly possible. Katniss argues they don't know better, while the idiot argues otherwise and that they are still evil even if they are unwitting participants in the cruelty of the Hunger Games. Then later on, when Coin is about to make the announcement, Katniss runs up to her to also ask pardon for Annie, because remember, she forgot. I needed to add Annie Cresta to the immunity list, I tell her. The president frowns slightly. Who's that? She's Finnick Odair's, what? I don't really know what to call her. She's Finnick's friend. From District 4, another Victor. She was arrested and taken to the capital when the arena blew up. Oh, the mad girl. That's not really necessary, she says. We don't make a habit of punishing anyone that frail. I think of the scene I walked in on this morning, of Octavia huddled against the wall, of how Coin and I must have vastly different definitions of frailty. Then Coin says this during the announcement. But in return for this unprecedented request, Soldier Everdeen has promised to devote herself to our cause. It follows that any deviance from her mission, in either motive or deed, will be viewed as a break in this agreement. The immunity would be terminated and the fate of the 4 victors determined by the law of District 13, as would her own. Thank you. In other words, I step out of line and we're all dead. And I think that this chapter does a lot of legwork to set up Coin for the twist reveal. This chapter displays perfectly all the biases that Coin has. She beefs with Katniss pretty overtly and is harsh on her. She views capital people as subhuman because they give them no grace or leniency when they understandably fail to adhere to the extremely rigid rules of their district. She outright tortures them over a piece of bread, and she also barely shows any care for the tributes. Katniss is very unambiguously viewed as a pawn. Coin also calls other victors who are used by the capital war criminals, and she pays no respect to Annie, who survived the Hunger Games. Her treatment of the former capital citizens who had no direct benefit to her is a direct parallel to Snow. Snow also treats people around him as tools and does as he pleases when they dare cross him. He also views the districts as subhuman, a direct opposite of Coin in the bigot scale. I was genuinely surprised with how unambiguous the book was about Coin, and guess just how much of this is presented in Mockingjay Part 1? Well, Well, you could also think just how much of this couldn't be presented in Mockingjay Part 1, because consider this, the movie makes a huge show of Snow being this third act villain they cannot possibly cast Coin in a villainous light. If they had included the treatment of the prep team and other personal attacks Coin throws, their rebellion would have been seen as incredibly hypocritical. It is certainly the intention in the book, but the book is a contained narrative. It doesn't make us much of a huge show of Snow's villainness in there. The first movie didn't have the leeway to explore this hypocrisy, since they had a whole plot of its own and a whole movie of taking down Snow ahead of them. They couldn't have had the rebel leader be awful 1/4 into the first Mockingjay movie. It doesn't necessarily demerit the Coin of the movies. You can make a case that the movie Coin is more skillful manipulator and headcanon her actions under her being deep undercover, but no backup for certain ideas presented in the movie makes her a lesser version of what she is in the books. She just falls flat. It's just my opinion. So to return from the adaptational tangent into the second movie, I will give Mockingjay Part 2 this. The scene where Katniss goes to talk with President Snow in his rose garden and where he reveals the twist to Katniss is amazing.
Oh, make no mistake. She intends to take my place now. I've been watching you, and you watching me. I'm afraid we've both been played for fools.
Honestly, the whole movie is kind of good. I won't lie, I like it. Amazingly acted, incredibly delivered, and also conceptually magnificent. I think to end the movie and the book with the realization that President Coin was just the other side of the coin to Snow was brilliant. I have no notes on the concept. Suzanne Collins was playing 4D chess and ran circles around any other YA novel all the way back in 2010. And while I may not entirely agree with certain choices, Mockingjay Part 2 will forever have my respect for the sole fact that it exists. Honestly, I am so happy that they did end up fully committing to both movies to convey this narrative. And this movie was truly a great farewell to a now bygone era of young adult dystopian movie adaptations, a type of era never to be seen again. That was until Suzanne Collins decided to say psych. On June 17th of the year of 2019, Suzanne Collins announces she is gonna release a prequel book set 64 years before the original Hunger Games. Honest opinion? I was a bit skeptical, but still interested. And I remember where I was when that Entertainment Weekly article hit the internet. I was doing my math homework since I was in my last year of high school. EW published the first excerpt from the book that would be called The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and it was then that I knew I was gonna be in for a ride. If you weren't there, the excerpt reveals that first of all, President Snow, of all people, is our protagonist, and second of all, he gets paired up with the District 12 girl. Oh, and this excerpt also revealed that Snow was now a mentor in the Hunger Games 10th annual, and that already was kinda a bunch of bullshit, but I can let that one slide, I guess. When I saw that, I mustered the biggest eye roll possible. That one reveal already felt so fucking stupid for no reason. I wasn't sure how I was going to keep a straight face on while reading it, because the author absolutely did not have to do that. That is how I feel about this entire project, both book and movie. I will be honest and say that I was excited to return to the Hunger Games world, but not under these exact circumstances, and there are so many layers to this nonsense and I don't even know where to begin. So let's begin with the first layer and the fact that this is Hunger Games. So the author clearly listened to everyone clamoring for more actual games in their Hunger Games and decided to give us the 10th. So the book and the movie decide to take these games as an opportunity to show us how we got what we see in the 74th. And that is honestly the first issue. The 10th Hunger Games exist in this weird spot of the Capitol kind of not really liking the games. Up until that point, from what I understand, the Capitol basically just threw everyone in the same general area, called it the arena, and called it a day. So they are basically on the brink of being called off. What does the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes do? They show all the ways that the Capitol tries to make the games fun. This edition sees the introduction of sponsors, which apparently were not a thing before but are now. It also sees the introduction of betting on tributes and also the introduction of the mentors. And also they had introduced interviews with the tributes, and most of these ideas, except for the mentorship thing, in the movie came from none other than Coriolanus Snow. I think what sort of downgrades the narrative for me is that all of this basically happens in the span of a single game. Like suddenly the Capitol gets this massive revelation about the games and it's like this breaking point. I expected for these developments to be more gradual, which I feel would be a bit more realistic, but nah. All of them have to happen at the same time in the same games because we want to feature the full Hunger Games. And then we also want to have that prequel energy in there, you know? The movie is actually kind of worse with this. One notable deviation from the book is that the movies introduce its own version of a career spec. It is a thing in both the first two movies and I think in the first two books where the tributes from better off districts team up to take others down. It is then to introduce an us versus them dynamic in the games and to spice them up narratively, but that doesn't happen in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the book, because it wouldn't make sense. By the time of Katniss's games, there are huge incentives in winning the games, which is why some districts specifically prepare their children to fight these games. These kids usually volunteer to go in there and they have a way bigger likelihood to win. That is why they're called the career pack. These kids view the games as an actual contest, so of course they have better incentive to form alliances and to game the actual game. This doesn't even exist until the 10th Hunger Games in any shape or form, and the book shows this by making the tributes scuttle away from the center of the arena. The movie goes for the dumb move of having its own cornucopia scene, and then tributes forming alliances, which is honestly bullshit, and it is a bad choice in adaptation. You know what? That's kind of fine. But then we get to the second layer and get to the fact that it also involves the young President Snow. Both the book and the movie have Snow live in decrepit conditions. His family falls into bad times due to his father, Crassus Snow, getting killed. His mother also was killed by rebels, I believe, so in the present time of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, he's living with his grandma and cousin Tigris. They live in a very rundown apartment and they are barely scraping by. Tigris works for a fashion designer, Fabricia Whatnot. The names in this book are just something. And Snow is eyeing the so-called Plinth Prize that he wants to win in the Academy for good grades. So Snow has a lot of riding on that prize. Now, the book originally has it so that the mentorship is just an additional assignment towards university. The movie has more drama to it, as initially Snow thinks that he already has the prize for his good grades, and it is portrayed as a rug pull when it is revealed that the conditions are changed right before the reaping, and Casca Highbottom himself announces that the Plinth Prize now hinges upon being the best mentor. Also, the way Casca delivers the news is something.
Oh, you'll be happy about this, Miss Crane. The Rug Girl, District 12. She belongs to Coriolanus Snow.
I think the movie makes a very specific choice to make him more taunting towards Snow. This is done to better convey the beef between Casca and Snow, but both the movie and the book kinda lead to the same outcome. Now Snow's survival leans on his tribute winning. He gets the District 12 girl, which I guess places him in the worst position possible, since District 12 isn't expected to do well in the games ever. Again, this is portrayed as a huge middle finger from Highbottom. One of the smarter things about the movie and the book is that they make the District 12 tribute to Lucy Gray not a survivalist like Katniss, but a true performer. Snow immediately susses out that she wouldn't do well in combat, and what does he do? He begins gaming the system in his favor. The book and the movie do the thing of having a character be hella inventive when life demands it, and while Devil works hard, Snow works harder. This becomes the reason why he proposes betting and getting to know the tributes in the first place. He sees the advantage of his tribute and wants Lucy Gray to charm the country in the way she charmed him. This basically pushes Snow to act the way he does in order to get that prize, which ultimately results in the games becoming what they are, which is a spectacle. Snow, while trying to survive in his own way, becomes a symbol of how the districts exploit the tributes for their own personal gain and for their entertainment. You know what? I can stomach that. I don't agree with the rushed nature of these developments, but I can forgive it because they do have a point and they make sense. But then we have the last layer, which is a layer that kinda crosses the book and the movie into fanfiction writing and is a bit of tomfoolery. So this may not have been conveyed the best in the movie, but in the book, Snow becomes obsessed with Lucy. He's very possessive towards her and he sees her as his, something he's entitled to. It's his perverse idea of love. The movie does retain some essence of this since they do seem romantically involved, and it once again leads to the same outcomes for both the movie and the book. So since Lucy Gray is from District 12, and she can also sing, is part of the group called the Covey, we also have to have her be related to the Hanging Tree song that Katniss sings in the original trilogy. In the movie and book, we see a man named Arlo Chance be detained and brought to the Hanging Tree. His girlfriend is there, and Arlo tells her to get the hell out of there. And Lucy, of course, gets to observe all of this, and so someone allows Lucy to cook, and she comes up with the Hanging Tree song. And this is, of course, some industrial-grade symbolism. What happens between Lucy Gray and Corio after she wins the games is that she is returned to District 12, and Corio is caught for cheating in the games and giving Lucy an unfair advantage. So he gets sent away to be a peacekeeper and chooses to go to District 12. In the book, his time in the districts is depicted in a lot of grueling detail, like Suzanne Collins did not hold back and decided to just fully develop a whole new storyline for the last third of the book. Thank the heavens that the movie truncated it, but the essence is kind of the same. Snow gets tangentially involved with some rebel activity, shit gets way out of hand as he kills 2 people, and so him and Lucy have to run away. They run away to a small lake house, and he becomes suspicious of Lucy. Now, movie Lucy is a bit of an idiot for this because she just drops this line.
No more of the sex.
Besides me,
Besides you wouldn't tell anyone?
Of course not.
Which, I mean, okay girl, good job, you just told on yourself. At least she didn't announce it on the megaphone or something, jeez. The book Lucy doesn't do that, but that doesn't increase her survival chances either way. Lucy then flakes on Snow, and Snow makes leaps and heaps in the mental gym and tells himself that she will kill him. So he goes out into the forest and begins blasting away at the trees full of mockingjays that sing none other than the hanging tree. Yay! Lucy Gray's fate is left entirely ambiguous, which is an idea that is carried over from the William Wordsworth's poem that Lucy is named after. So what the movie is saying is that Snow doesn't know where Lucy Gray went, but he will for sure feel her everywhere now since she will haunt him through the Hanging Tree song. And I don't know whether this is insanely brilliant or insanely dumb. First of all, do you have any idea of the psychic damage that the ambiguity of Lucy Gray's fate did to the fandom? Lucy Gray is Coin! Lucy Gray is Greasy Say! Lucy Gray is the grandmother of Katniss. Lucy Gray is your mom. Okay, I made that last one up, but you get the point. But second of all, so you're telling me that Snow didn't hate Katniss only because of his general hatred towards the districts, but he also hated her because District 12 had premium hatred plus over a generational beef with a girl he once mentored? I am entirely undecided whether I like this or not. Because on one hand, having Lucy haunt him from the ambiguous beyond is cool. The writing for this fate, when isolated, is very smart. But on the other hand, it kind of ruins the vibe of Katniss Everdeen, a random girl from a backwater district, took down the oppressive regime, because now her actions have this additional Lucy Gray quality to them that I don't particularly like. The book is even more obnoxious about its symbolism. For instance, Snow has beef with Mockingjay birds immediately, which is as ham-fisted as it gets. And then we get to the other half of this tomfoolery, which is Snow, Highbottom, and Snow's dad Crassus. Now the story goes that Gaul assigned them the final task of thinking up a punishment for their enemies that was so extreme that they would never be allowed to forget how they had wronged them. Highbottom got drunk and he came up with the Hunger Games. Highbottom thought that it would stay between them, but Crassus went ahead and submitted it to Gaul, and she liked it so much that she implemented it. And that was how the games were born. Again, feels a bit fanfiction-y, but I can stomach this under certain pretenses. I don't recall all the details in the books exactly, but the movie makes this very pointed attempt to show that Snow has become like his father right at the end there.
I think you look just like your father, Coriolanus.
It's an interesting thread of logic that I don't think was explored enough in the adaptation. His father was a general and a strategist with supposed nerves of steel. He was apparently cold and distant, so Snow was never that attached to him. And I think that the logic here is that Snow came out a certain way because of that upbringing. I like this idea, and that Snow wound up in the military as well, and was also highly strategic and calculating in the way he approached people. I can see why Tigris would say that at the end of the movie, because deep inside Coriolanus is very much like his father, and his facade at the end just finally fully drops and he just fully embraces that side of him. I just wish that there was more of this shown off, like maybe a flashback or something, and I believe that there is merit in Snow unwittingly building onto what his father helped create, since they are kind of the same, but nah fam. The only elaboration that the movie gives us is...
Your father is dead, Coriolanus. It was a rebel, they say. A trap out in the forest in 12.
Because of course it was. So as a prequel, I feel like it is such an odd one, because at no point would I necessarily say that what is written doesn't make sense, and I like that, everything does make sense. But it is fucking wild that practically every symbol or idea introduced in the original trilogy occurred over the span of like a couple of months, was heavily related to District 12, and in Snow's life in particular, and I blame the movie adaptations for it. The movies did a lot more for President Snow than the books ever did, and I believe that the author helped while writing the additional material in the movies for Snow. So I do think she most likely had the idea for Snow fleshed out, but the movies also really emphasize his personal beef with Katniss in particular, and that type of rationale is all over this book and movie. They even got the Katniss mention in there with some soundtrack from the original movies, because of course they did.
It's a little early yet, Maud Ivory. No.
Early for what?
To eat the roots. Some people call it swamp potato. I think Katniss has a much nicer ring, don't you?
and that is just kind of corny. The biggest issue is that the book and the movie are not concerned with showing Coriolanus Snow as his own character. It is far more concerned with showing him as President Snow, the villain to Katniss Everdeen. Think about it. From all that Ballad tells us about Snow, he is the perfect villain for Katniss, and Katniss in particular. He has the authority and power, he made the games what they are, he oppresses everyone, but also gets petty and obsessed with Katniss because his special connection to District 12, and he saw the origin of the song that Katniss eventually sings, and also she becomes associated with the Mockingjays. No other tribute in the original trilogy fits the bill that perfectly, and I am not sure how much I like that. Hot take, but the Snow in the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes feels like he was backwards engineered from Katniss, while I don't believe it should have been the case. I don't particularly like that there is this implication that somehow Katniss was in a way predestined character who would come to take him down while also wielding the power of Lucy Gray's ghost in her arsenal. Katniss's whole thing was that she was just a pawn in someone else's game all the time, both for Snow and for Coin. She got caught up in it because she was a random girl from a random district, and she did something bold because of who she is as a character. It shouldn't be deeper than this. These choices have spawned the most interesting discussions though. There's a team of people ready to say that, oh my god, that is how everything is connected, with awe and joy, and there's a team of people to say, yeah, maybe it's not the best and it's a bit fanfiction-y, but it doesn't mean that it influenced Snow that much, and it can exist with other reasons Snow was obsessed with her, and I disagree with both of these views. The Covey are a wandering group. In the book it is stated that they used to wander across districts until they were forced to settle in 12. People think they are similar to the Romani people, and it's not that much of a stretch. So you mean to tell me that this group could have ended up anywhere, and the author chose 12, and that somehow isn't supposed to mean much? It was the one instance where their district background was irrelevant, and the book chooses 12, and that somehow isn't meant to have any significance whatsoever? There are other randomly assorted critiques that I have towards world building. For instance, the names of characters after a while become whack. The movie is actually better than the book because, at least in the movie, you didn't have to constantly read them over and over. Suzanne really went ham on the names, and some of them are so whack. A random critique that I saw is people getting triggered over the fact that Lecky Flickerman is the weatherman and host, and he is related to Caesar Flickerman from the original trilogy. People keep calling that unrealistic, but y'all, if they are father and son, that is the most realistic aspect of the entire book series. You know what keeps shocking and surprising me while living through life? Just how much the elites and famous people can be related to each other and how close of a circle it is. Suzanne Collins nails this, honestly. Anyhow, now that you listened to my mentee B about the world building and certain other choices and how it's layered in weirdness, we can now get to the core of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Should this book and movie have been made? A surprising amount of people have expressed that they did not want to engage in Ballad because it followed Snow, the evil dictator from the OG trilogy. That was because people were scared that the book would humanize the devil. Well, people, what is so bad with humanizing him? I think there is a difference between making him sympathetic and making him human. I think I never had a shred of doubt that Suzanne Collins would find a way to handle Snow as a character in a way that wasn't glamorizing him. And she does the smart and clever thing of giving us some crucial context to an otherwise complicated character. Because indeed Snow is also complex and complicated. It has to be said that the book Snow is a tough read because we get to hear the internal monologue of Coriolanus Snow, and trust me, it is not pretty. First, he saw firsthand the first rebellion. His dad was one of the generals and was killed during it. His own upbringing was highly dysfunctional because his mother died, his father was cold to him and also proceeded to die. The book has a few moments where he sits down and remembers some flashes of his mother and father, so you can feel their absence way more than you do in the movie. He also survived a period of awful conditions during and after the war. The book does a way better job at conveying this, but the Snow family was in deep poverty and barely had anything to eat. Of course, that took a toll on Snow both physically and mentally, as he tried to survive and he tried his best to pretend that his family was doing better than it actually was. In many ways, it is not his fault that he ends up where he does when he is like 16 years old. His peers have parents, they have money, and he is just kicked way down. And then there's also Casca fucking Highbottom, just hanging around the scene like a demented bat. And I have a few things to say about him. I find it interesting how Crassus Snow just hangs over the narrative through Casca. We have already discussed why. They had their shared history, which eventually developed into a generational beef, and that caused Casca to be pissy towards Corio. And once again, the book and movie Casca's fates are the same, but I will say that the movie does some things maybe slightly better or slightly worse than the movie. In the book, Coriolanus goes into the Reaping knowing full well he will be the mentor. The whole mentorship thing is an assignment for the academy students to just elevate themselves and have a better chance of getting a scholarship into the university. Coriolanus is a good student, and that is why he even gets a chance at mentorship. There is the Plinth Prize that is also mentioned in the movie, but the Plinth Prize in the book comes after they become mentors and is not tied to the games from the get-go. Strabo Plinth creates the prize because his son Sejanus keeps acting up, so he wants to basically buy the good graces of the capital. It is introduced in chapter 16 of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and it's supposed to give a full ride to the university for the person whose mentee wins the games. This is a big deal for Corio, which is outlined in his internal monologue. The bigger news was the possibility of winning the Plinth Prize. It was independent of the academy, so Dean Highbottom wouldn't have any say in it. Even Dr. Gall would not. A full ride that would free him from their power and lift this awful anxiety about the future from his shoulders. The book portrays the Plinth Prize as salvation for Corio while keeping him incentivized to win the games. The movie adaptation switches things around in a way that I find both an improvement and a downgrade. The Plinth Prize is immediately there, and Corio keeps talking about it from the beginning. He expects to get it for his good grades and thinks it's in the bag. So he goes into the academy to find out that Highbottom and Gall had decided to step in and move the goalposts, and that the Plinth Prize would now go to the victor's mentor.
I am here to tell you that there has been a change. One final assignment to prove your worth. The Plinth Prize will no longer be determined by who has the best grades, by who is the best mentor in the Hunger Games.
It is also implied in book and movie that Highbottom specifically gave him the District 12 girl, who was expected to die fast. This of course infuriates Snow, and honestly, rightfully so. The dude worked for it to try and help his family. He was talking with his family just minutes ago how they would spend it.
I can grow plenty more after today.
Got the grades, never missed class. 10 years. Even Dean Highbottom can't deny us this now. What's the first thing you'll spend the prize money on? New dress? Chocolate? It's the Plinth Prize, Tigers. We'll be able to pay the rent.
And I assume they changed the conditions of it to not be a uni tuition but way bigger. You also have to admit that having to root for someone to survive in a game of death to get your salvation is an insane price to pay, and Coriolanus doesn't really see it in that way. He immediately jumps to think of a strategy for his tribute. There's also a scene that is changed from the book, and that change shows Snow taking the games into his hands more. The original scene happens in chapter 6 and takes place in the academy. Gall decides to visit them and they discuss how it's going mentoring the tributes. Sejanus makes a scene out of it, saying that they should be more humane towards the tributes and show compassion. This gives Gall the idea to make the tributes more sympathetic so that the viewers would have someone to root for. In the movie, however, it is Snow who listens to Sejanus and comes up with that idea.
The capital is supposed to be everyone's government now. It is supposed to protect all of us.
That sort of sympathy might interfere with your mentoring assignment.
Perhaps the game's time has passed.
Dean Highbottom is wrong. Maybe Sejanus is onto something here. Maybe we should be viewing those tributes as human beings.
Which is not the best look overall, but it does make sense that he is trying to work with what he has. And guess who keeps haunting Snow throughout the movie and taunting him? Highbottom. There is a scene in the middle of the movie where Casca comes in to taunt him yet again, and he tells Snow directly that it doesn't even matter if Lucy won. Casca was responsible for the prize, and he would make sure that Snow got nothing.
What do you want from that girl?
Nothing. I want her to live.
And the Plinth Prize would be a happy coincidence, I suppose.
I believe I'd be entitled to it.
Of course you do. Of course you do. Who do you think makes that final decision for the prize you so covet, Mr. Snow? Even if Lucy Greybeard somehow wins it all, I will do everything in my power to ensure that you don't see a dime.
And then the dude has the audacity to ask how much he cares for Lucy now that she wouldn't earn him his bag.
Ask yourself, how much do you care if she lives now?
So then we get to the ending scene after everything is done. Snow returns to the capital and goes to Highbottom to take revenge on him. The original scene plays out in the epilogue of the book, and the movie is somewhat close to the text. The one notable difference, besides the line about mysteries, is what Casca tells Snow about Snow's role in the Hunger Games.
But then you came along. Now the blood of so many more generations will be on my hands, because you've shown us the price people are willing to pay for a good show.
This isn't in the book, and it is pretty on the nose, I would say. But you know what? It does stick out that Casca is the one saying this, because you can say that due to the changes in the movie, Casca basically forced Coriolanus to participate in all of this. Had Coriolanus just received his rightfully earned prize, he would have never ended up getting involved in games like this. Dare I say it? Snow is perversely genius in the way his mind began turning once he managed to find a strategy. If he had never been pushed to the absolute extreme point, he wouldn't have even come up with all of these ways to make the games better. And it is further ironic, considering that it was Casca himself who picked out District 12 for Snow. Admittedly, it did place Snow at a disadvantage because Lucy Gray wasn't a fighter, but he manipulated the rules around her to make her win. He was friggin' effective in that. I kind of like this change because it layers High Bottom with a tinge of vengeance that ultimately dooms Snow down his path. The situation with Snow becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, considering that Casca did a lot of projecting on Corio in the first place from knowing his father. And while Crassus did pull Casca into the nasty business of the games, Casca pulled Coriolanus into the nasty business of the games, which ultimately severely backfired on Casca. And whose fault is that? I also dislike this change, because it softens Snow in ways that I am not sure made the situation better, especially since we get none of the narration that we get in the book. The prize has way more importance for survival of Snow and his family, therefore more extreme measures he takes are just so slightly more reasonable. I prefer the mundanity of the mentorship in the book. It is a wild concept how survival of district children relied at least in part of some capital teenagers who were just there to get a good grade. I would say that Casca becomes like this weird looming shadow of the sins and mistakes of his father that still reaches him and shapes him beyond the grave, and it ironically turns Coriolanus exactly into his father, and I love that connection. It also reminds me of Lucy Gray, who would also become a symbol of his own mistakes, haunting him forwards. It must be pointed out that Casca didn't really create the monster, he only amplified what was already there, but he certainly didn't stop Snow from snowballing. Pun completely intended, into the possessive and obsessive maniac he becomes. If only he had recognized that Coriolanus was not responsible for what his father did and was less of a petty bitch about it, maybe Snow would have turned out differently. The book goes to great lengths to put Snow into the context of his parents. People constantly compare his looks to his father's throughout the book. There are even moments where he says that he would like to be more like his mother, but then there is always Casca to mess him up. And then there is the matter of adapting Lucy Gray Baird, and that is a sore spot for this adaptation. To understand that, we must first look at how the book tells its story. The author makes a rather deliberate choice in breaking form from the original trilogy. The OG books were written first-person perspective, but the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes switches into the third-person perspective, and that is kinda genius. Suzanne Collins maintains a distance between the reader and Snow, first because that distance I think is necessary due to the nature of the character and him being in a fiction book, and second because it would be wildly uncomfortable to keep reading his thoughts in first person for a prolonged period of time. The third-person perspective still stays pretty close to Snow. We observe him, but we still get the world filtered through his point of view. And the genius of the book really jumps out when it introduces Lucy Gray, because Lucy, for all intents and purposes, is an absolute presence in the books. The movie makes a huge deviation in her portrayal, as Rachel Zegler plays Lucy Gray as a bit of a scared child, I would say, a bit more timid than the book. The book Lucy was not portrayed as vulnerable. In some ways she felt like a match to Snow's scheming. If you turn your head a little, you may realize that book Snow is also always on full performance mode. He is constantly thinking about the optics of a given situation and how appearing a certain way would benefit him. A notable example is how he approaches the death of Arachne Crane, his classmate who was murdered by one of the tributes. Coriolanus' initial reaction was to recoil like the others, to grab hold of the monkey house bars for support, but Lucy Gray hissed, "Help her." He remembered the camera streaming live to the Capitol audience. He had no idea what to do for Arachne, but he did not want to be seen cringing and clinging. His terror was a private thing, not meant for public display. Which is a perfectly reasonable chain of thought to think about when you see your classmate's throat slit in front of you. Wouldn't you also think about the optics of how you act when someone is murdered in front of you? The movie loses this dimension in many cases, but Tom Blythe, the actor for Coriolanus Snow, does his best to compensate and to display Snow as cold and calculating as he can. The book had this quality of the two of them sort of performing in front of everyone together. In the book, Lucy is much more involved in the actual planning of appearances than she is in the movie. She is also way more talkative and charismatic with both Snow and everyone else, so in a perverse way they are perfect for each other, you would say. But here comes the fact that we are indeed stuck in this maniac's head. We cannot really be fully sure that the way Snow thinks about Lucy Gray is a faithful representation of who Lucy Gray actually is. His whole breakdown at the end hinges upon the fact that he is so paranoid about what she can do that he inherently just doesn't trust her. This puts into question a lot of what we see about Lucy through Snow, because if he was able to make these leaps towards the end, it is concerning to think about what other leaps Snow managed to make about Lucy Gray and her behavior across the entire novel. We cannot rely on him, because who is to say that he didn't just have this huge desire to have a manic pixie dream girl for a GF and didn't just fanfiction half of their interactions in his head. So that gives the movie adaptation the small space to to do with the character what they want, but I am not sure I entirely like what they do with her. She's characterized as way more hesitant, less of a presence, a bit more gentle and petite, and I think this is just a result of the weird leveling game that the movie has to do without the internal narration of Snow, because Snow on the surface is not as horrible as he is internally, therefore solely his actions are not as severe as the rationale behind them, so all we have is appearances and actions. But the movie understandably cannot make Lucy Gray seem somehow more proactive or more calculating than Snow, because I think we can agree to the fact that she never was. Snow might have thought they were fit for each other, but even he saw her as a possession, aka not an equal at all, because they are not. Snow wishes he was Lucy Gray, honestly. So the movie chooses to tone her confidence and proactiveness in the games down to make her unambiguously morally good. They move to different levels from page to screen, but they try to maintain the same distance between the characters in terms of morality. I think it is a loss for the movie, but also not necessarily the movie's fault, so it may make me a bit disappointed, but I can see why Lucy Gray is the way she is in the movie, and that is how I just see the entire project of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I cannot understate enough just how it is strong conceptually. It has a very explicit clarity of purpose, and that is usually what you want in your fictional work, for that work to have something to say. But I feel like the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is just too full with things to say. It feels like it was written with a list in mind that the author for some reason felt she had to fulfill in exactly this book. It feels cramped with the amount of things it has to say, or rather it feels like it has to say. I do not like just how related everything is. It genuinely makes me feel a bit claustrophobic in this world. I will compliment Ballad though, for the sheer ingenuity in how it manages to make a coherent plot that is rife with meaning and manages to pick up so many things in such a clean way. It may be a bit crammed, but the prequel does not retcon anything that I know of, does not create plot holes, does not have to fix plot holes from previous works. It is a very clean extension of this world, so even if I may not agree with the approach taken, it is an impressive exercise in fiction writing, and I cannot help but respect that, at least on a technical level. So where does that leave us now? That leaves us with Sunrise on the Reaping, and I haven't read it yet. I have my copy, both physical in Lithuanian and virtual English one. I read approximately 10% of it so far. Don't judge me, okay? I also read the wiki, because I'm a nosy bitch. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the movie. I think I will read it before the movie comes out, and maybe there's gonna be another video of me yapping about Hunger Games again. So what is the conclusion of this video? Well, I respect the hell out of the Hunger Games. I think what I come to appreciate more and more is that there are a lot of books and movies from that specific YA era that have been forgotten, but Hunger Games really sticks with you because it actually has something to tell you about the world. It is okay for a book or a movie to exist for the sole reason of entertainment, but Hunger Games was never that, and you know what? I may disagree with some choices taken, but that is okay, because Hunger Games is still leagues ahead of some of the things out there. Even for someone who practices creative writing, I do get amazed by the series, because when you write something and have that clarity of purpose, the difference becomes night and day. I may drag some choices made, but at the very least, I know that they weren't made on vibes. There's always some type of irrationale, and every word and dialogue is so carefully weighted against the themes of the series that you cannot help but admire it. Even now, being a full-on adult, I am happy to have experienced the Hunger Games. If you have not, you should. And that is just that on that. I wanted to talk about the Hunger Games for a while now, and I knew it would take a lot, and it's the longest video I made in a while. So if you like that and want to see more of it, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, write a comment. You know, the engagement really helps. I try to put out these videos as much as I can while getting crushed by university master's work, but it is what it is. Oh, and as a little parting gift, while I was looking for material for the thumbnail, I found this photo on a wallpaper website. I thought it was cute. Anyway, have a nice day and goodbye.